Sound speeds, and welcome to another episode of the podcast that replaces speed bumps. I'm not 100% sure as to what I'm going to call it just yet. I'm still on the fence about it. I've gotten a few suggestions. I'm not 100% on board with all of them, or even any of them, really. I'm kind of just on the fence. I mean, honestly, since the Speed Bumps podcast went over 30 episodes, and that was basically taking place in a vehicle, and this is more of just a sound-related podcast, my instinct is to call it the Sound Speeds podcast, even though I did one of those years ago. I could call that one the old Sound Speeds podcast, and this one the new one, or just, I don't know. I'm still on the fence about it. Give me a few more episodes, and we'll come up with a name just in time to cancel this, unless we keep it going. I don't know just yet. We're still on the fence about a lot of things. Anyway, let's waste no more time and get right into the content. One of the most common questions that content creators get is, what is the best blank for me? Can you recommend one of those? So if you deal with cameras, there's going to say, what's the best camera for me? If you deal with sound, what's the best microphone for me, or best interface, or whatever. And I'm no different. People always ask me my thoughts and opinions, and it's always some open-ended question. What's a great microphone I could use indoors and outdoors? Okay, in what scenario? What kind of stuff are you using it for? Or they'll say, I do a podcast, or I'm starting a podcast. What is a good microphone for me? There's a lot of factors to consider. But a lot of the times people don't understand what factors those are to consider. So I thought I would discuss some of them in this episode. So let me start off with this. Depending on the environment that you're going to be in, you have to think about a microphone that picks that environment up and what doesn't pick up in that environment. For example, if you're going to be doing something outdoors, let's say you're going to be doing a lot of location interviews. You're going to be shooting outdoors in all kinds of environments. Outdoors means you don't have to worry as much about reflecting sound. So you don't have to worry about a shotgun microphone bouncing the sound off of the concrete below somebody and coming right back up into the microphone and potentially causing reverberations or echo. What you do need to be aware of is outside sounds that could get into that microphone and cause a higher amount of noise. So what you need to do in that environment is pick something a little more directional. Now, if you want to use the same microphone indoors and outdoors, then you might want to get yourself something that is decent at rejecting, but still has a little bit of a wider pattern. The reason why is the more narrow pattern, the more it's going to hear in that one little direction. And when it hears in one direction and it happens to be pointed towards a wall, let's say, it's going to be picking up the sound bouncing off of that wall and back at you, because it's basically rejecting out sounds and not really paying attention to it except what's down the barrel. Now, microphones don't technically reject out sounds. What they are designed to do is to pick up with a higher degree of sensitivity an area of that microphone and less so in other areas. And the degree at which it is able to pick up a sound over the sounds around it is what we call rejection. So if it's able to pick up down the barrel, it's a sound that's, let's say it's 0 dB, and then off axis, it's able to reject out and lower, attenuating the sound around it by, let's say, 12 decibels, then we would say typically that has 12 decibels of attenuation or rejection. And the same kind of thing holds true if you get a more directional type microphone. It will reject maybe 16 or 18 decibels, maybe even more than that. Professional microphones, just because it's professional doesn't mean it's going to reject out more or better. That could mean that it's going to pick up in better detail and quality than the cheaper microphones. Some of the cheaper microphones may reject out more sounds simply because it doesn't care if it's designed properly and what the sound quality is like coming down the barrel. They're bragging about the fact that it's able to reject out sounds. So that is just one small factor to consider. Just like frequency response, there's more to it than just looking at the frequency response and figuring out if that is a good microphone to get for that reason. You can't ever tell it just by looking at that one factor. Just like if I said, oh, well, here's the noise floor. Well, there's more to it than just that. What if I were to say, here's the sensitivity. This is a very sensitive microphone. You want one that can pick up stuff. Well, it's more to it than just that too. That's the reason why you have all these different specifications to consider, a lot of factors to consider as well. So if you're going to be doing doing something with a microphone, ask yourself first, where am I going to be using this? That is the first question to ask. If you're going to be using it outdoors only, then get yourself something that's going to reject out those outside noises. If you're going to be using it indoors only, then ask yourself, what does it sound like in that environment? Are there any sounds you don't want to pick up, or sounds that you want to make sure you pick up and you're not concerned as much about the sounds you don't want to pick up, whether it's indoors or outdoors? Many people that do podcasts or recording inside, they are just concerned about picking up their own voice, but it's not about what you want to pick up, it's about what you don't want to pick up. It's one of those things where people don't always think about the fact that a higher quality microphone is great at picking things up, but it also picks up the undesirable sounds. It's kind of like mechanical sounds. Microphones usually will pick up mechanical sounds very well because it's designed to pick up mechanical type noises very well, because those are usually frequencies that are going to pick up very well into a microphone. So rumbles, high-pitched whirring and whistlings and all that kind of stuff, those kinds of sounds are going to be picked up very well from a microphone. And people's voices, for example, aren't going to be picked up necessarily nearly as well, even though the weighting curve, the pickup sensitivity of certain frequencies right in the vocal range are going to be more peaked. Those other sounds that our ears are not as tuned to are going to be picked up just as easily on a microphone. So you have to first figure out what you want to pick up and what you don't want to pick up. If there are sounds you don't want to pick up, then try to reduce that with the microphone itself. The less you have to do in processing, the better. If you can get a microphone that you don't have to do any processing on, thumbs up. That means you've done a great job with your environment. It's because you have good, proper mic technique. It's because you're doing everything exactly right. If you have to go in and start EQing and you have to start doing noise reduction, you have to start doing all these different things in order to make it sound good, chances are you're going to be over-processing to begin with, and it's not going to sound good by the time you're done. If you happen to be one of those people that know what they're doing in processing, it's not ideal to process out things. It is more ideal to get a microphone that serves that purpose. You may have to experiment and figure out what is going to work. For example, if you are looking at a supercardioid pattern microphone and a hypercardioid pattern microphone, you might not be able to tell much of a difference, but a hyper or super and a cardioid pattern microphone, those will sound different. A super or a hyper will have more reach, meaning that it's going to be able to pick up at a greater distance than a cardioid. But the cardioid, if you're up close, is going to have a fatter signal. It's going to pick up a better balance of the frequencies coming from your head all the way down to your chest, as opposed to something like a super or a hyper that might only pick this area up, or even a shotgun. So it's one of those things where you need to understand patterns of the microphone as well. And so if you're trying to pick a microphone for a podcast and you're in an environment that's untreated, okay, what do you not want to hear? The room itself, because there's a lot of reverberations and stuff. It's first of all ideal to treat those reverberations and make it so that way it's not even an issue anymore. But if you don't want to do that, then you need to ask yourself, what microphone is going to pick up my voice really well and less so the other sounds in the room? Well, it's probably going to be a dynamic microphone. Part of that is because, and I do have a video about that you can check out if you want. Part of that is, though, because a dynamic microphone picks up less frequencies than a condenser. And those frequencies mean cutting out some of the extreme sounds that would be more noticeable to you, like the low-pitched rumbling or a high-pitched whistling and whirring. Those kinds of sounds are not going to be picked up as well by a dynamic, but a condenser would pick them up. But at the same time, a condenser is going to be more sensitive and it's going to pick up in greater detail than a dynamic. So if you're just trying to get rid of background sounds and you don't want to actually treat your environment, then getting a dynamic microphone may work. Now, if you are constantly recording interviews, but you can't get the microphone within a foot or two, you may need to get a shotgun microphone. But if you're constantly sitting right on the edge of frame with your microphone, then you may be perfectly happy with something more like a pencil condenser, because that would pick up a nice full sound, but still reject out some stuff. And you don't have to necessarily have the reach of a shotgun microphone, nor do you want to have the directionality and the ability to reach way down into a shot while cutting out some of the outside sounds. Because you got to keep in mind, if it is just picking up an area like this on your face, then you're not getting as much bass from your chest. You're not going to be hearing it's not going to sound as natural and full. So if you can widen out your pattern a little bit, that's going to be better. And not just by backing away either, because then your sensitivity will be still there, but your signal to noise ratio you'll start to hear more noise. So you want to do that. So the long and the short of it is, if you're trying to pick yourself out a good microphone, you need to look at your environment first. The next thing you want to look at is what you're trying to pick up and at what distance. So if you're trying to be fairly close to someone, then you don't need to be overly wide with a pattern. I'm sorry, overly narrow with a pattern. You could be, wider, but then are you trying to reject out sounds? Because if you are, you need to have a more narrow pattern in order to reject those things out. And so you have to then think, what am I trying to accomplish with this microphone? Am I trying to pick up a voice? Am I trying to reject out sounds? Whatever. And at that point, you can really start to dial in on the sound quality you want, the detail that you want, the kind of sound you want your voice to have. One of the tricks that I usually use when I am on set trying to figure out how I want that person to sound when I'm booming is I will listen to those actors talking to the director, talking to the script supervisor, talking to producers, talking to even the sound utility when they wire up talent. I will listen to their voice with my ears, not through headphones, but with my ears, my actual ears. And I will listen to how they sound. And based on the way I hear them sound, I will want them to sound that way in my microphone. So if I point the microphone and it's square, straight up and down, and they naturally tilt their head ever so slightly down, they're going to be off axis. And I'm going to start to hear them sound off axis. And they're not going to sound the same way. They're not going to sound as full. So what you need to do at that point is you need to cue the microphone back at their face a little bit so that way it's angled more at them from the front. So that's going to help you to pull out that sound and make it sound better. So usually that is what I will consider first. If I am in an environment where my normal microphones that the sound mixer wants me to use just aren't cutting it because there's too much background noise, then I will pick something that's going to reject out that background noise better while still making the person sound the way I want them to. If I'm indoors and I'm getting way too many footsteps, well, those sounds are nothing that I care anything about. So I'm going to try to play the pattern by cueing back and using that pattern more in front of them at their face. Even if I have to angle practically at their forehead or even over the top of their head, I will do that to get it more get the pattern more off their feet. And so I'm not hearing it as much. Another big thing is the Steadicam operator, the boom operator, the dolly grip, anybody who's walking on a walk and talk. You'll hear their footsteps too, and it'll sound like a whole herd of people, moving when there's only one person on their cell phone talking in the scene, something like that. All right. So as a rule, I will look at the environment and pick a microphone that will work well in that environment with regards to noise and pickup reach. The second thing is I'm going to try to make that sound as close to natural as possible of talent. And the third thing is I'm going to use that microphone to reject out any other types of sounds that are not necessary as to part of the scene. If we're doing a close-up shot, you don't need to hear anything that's outside of the frame if you don't need it. So you can hear it. Like if, for example, you know that you're in a big wide room and there's a big fire next to you. Well, if you can kill the fire and still have a flickering light effect that the gaffer or the chief lighting technician can generate with a flickering bulb, then that's cool. But if you have to have the fire, then you can have the fire because we know it's part of the scene. It was in the wide shot. So at that point, I would use the microphone and try to reject out that sound as something that's less desirable. And then once we punch in for coverage, you might need to get a wild sound of that flame, depending on how it sounds. If it's just propane and all it's doing is hissing, they're going to replace it with more of a crackly type, wooden sound in post probably anyway. But as a rule, what I will do is I will listen to the voice of the person I want to be picked up in the microphone. I will first try to reject out the environment, reach for the voice, and then make it sound as close as possible. Back in the 1990s, I had a friend that worked at Circuit City, and they, over there at Circuit City, got commission based on sales. And he worked in a division that installed car stereos into vehicles. So you could go there, you can pick out a stereo, and then they would try to upsell you on the 00 gauge, like pinky size cables, because it would say, well, you need to have a thick cable like that. You have a 300 watt amp. Let me explain something to you. Thick cables are a scam. If you are looking at a 00 gauge monster cable or something like that, and you're convinced that you have to have that for your car stereo, you don't. Here's the thing. They are not shielded. The reason why is because if you have a microphone that's very sensitive, like a dynamic microphone, then you need to use a really good quality cable to reject out any interference, because that microphone is not very sensitive. It has to go into a preamplifier that amplifies all the sounds, because it's just putting out a very small amount of voltage, and it has to amplify that in order to be a usable level. Once it's up at line level, then if you run it from that component to another component, then it's still fairly sensitive. You still have to run it through a cable that has shielding on it. But once you put it to an amplifier, that amplifier that goes to a speaker, it is now amped way up. It's a high amount of voltage. Little bitty amounts of interference are not going to be affecting it hardly any anymore, because there's so much amplification coming from that signal at its source. Once it's amplified, if it goes out through a cable, a little tiny bit of interference is not going to really affect it if there's 300 watts of power going through that thing. So here's the thing. When you look at your wall outlet at your house, at least in America, you know that there is 120 volts of alternating current and about 20 amps or 15 amps in your wall. Do the math on that. You're going to come up with 1,800 watts for a 15 amp breaker, or 2,400 watts for a 20 amp breaker. Okay? Simple math. 120 volts times 15 or 20. And that's how you come up with those numbers. The American Wire Gauge, AWG, makes cables of different thickness. The higher the number, AWG 22, is a thinner cable than AWG 16. Here's the thing. The thicker that cable gets, the more power it can handle when you're talking about electricity. But then what is really the difference between the electricity going through your wall and the electricity going from your sound, going out to your speakers? Not much. Because it is still volts, it is still amps, it is still overall watts. That's why our amplifiers, they say this is a 300 watt amplifier, RMS or peak, whatever. So if you are running in your wall AWG 14, what does that mean? That means it is rated to handle about 1,800 watts. If it is AWG 12, it is a slightly thicker cable, more expensive, but it can take 20 amps of 120 volts, which is 2,400 watts. If it can take 2,400 watts in power, it can also take 2,400 watts in your stereo system. So unless you are going to be running 100 amps, which is like a 12,000 watt sound system in your truck, you don't need to have a very low gauge or like a 00 gauge cable. You don't need to have a cable that's as thick as my pinky just to take your audio signal someplace. Back in the 90s, I designed two humongous speakers that were 50 inches tall, about 24 inches wide, maybe even a little bit more, and about 28 inches deep. It had W bins built into it. It had passive radiators, and it had dual 15s in there, plus a built-in crossover and that kind of stuff. I did all the formulas, and even then, it wasn't perfect because those speakers are very hard to design. But even those, when I powered off of my DJ sound system, it still worked just fine. When I bought myself a 100-foot, this is what I did. I bought a 100-foot 14/3 extension cable. That was a 14 gauge, 3 conductor. So it was a black, white, and black, white, and green. And I took that, and what I did is I said, okay, the white is going to be the positive, the black is going to be the negative, and the ground is going to be the ground. It's also unshielded because electric cables are. And then what I did is I ran that. I took on the amplifier side, I took the ground and I split it into 2. So basically I just took a wire, went around there, wrapped it around there, put some electrical tape over it, and then I ran it in to both the left and right side of my amplifier out. And then what I did is when I got to the first speaker in the run, so I just ran it through my one power cable, ran it through the house. And then when I wanted to break it out, what I did is I cut the shielding and peeled back an area of the shielding that was about 1 inch. And then I cut the white because I was going to the left first. I cut the white and I stripped off the shielding on the ground. Then what I did is I wrapped around a cable or a loose wire that had a little bit of insulation on it to the ground. So that way the ground would continue on to the other side. And I terminated the end of the white so it didn't need to go through the rest of the line. I didn't pull it all the way out, but I basically, stripped the cable and then I tied off the one that was going on to the end. And so that way I had two openings. I had two things that I could plug in the back of my speaker, those two open cables. So I had the green ground and then I plugged in the white to the positive. And then from there, the black continued on over to the right side. And the ground continued on over there because remember, the ground is basically a drain. It basically just drains out the signal. So you might think that when you plug in something to a wall or plug in something to an amplifier, it needs to have both of those to provide power. It doesn't work that way. It loops through is basically the way it works. It loops and goes out. That's the reason why you have to drain it. That's the reason why you have to have basically a drain. You can't just run power into something through the positive and expect it to work. It doesn't work that way. Nor does it run if you just plug in the negative. You have to have both of them connected for you to have power. Same kind of thing on a speaker or an amp. So I ran that one cable all the way through. And an AWG-14 it was, because I wasn't planning on putting through 1800 watts. Now I had two speakers. I had a full DJ system at the time, and I had two amps that I could bridge mono at 1800 total watts. That was 900 watts going out per channel because it was bridge mono in 8 ohms. But even then, it was still only half of the watts that you needed in order to power those speakers. And I ran it off of an AWG-14. Now, many times, more premium cables will be a thicker gauge, and that's fine. Not a problem. But what do you need and what are you required to? Whatever it's rated at. And you could go online and find simple charts that tell you the AWG and what the maximum amount of watts that you should put through is. But when it comes down to your home stereo system, when people try to upsell you or you need to replace a cable and they say, well, it's only $4.50 a foot for the 00, you should go ahead and get that. How many feet are we looking at here? 13 feet here, 13 feet there. It's going to be a total of 87 feet. So this is going to be a grand total of $400 and some odd dollars plus installation, $600 just for the cable. No. Absolutely not. You do not need it. So when people try selling you a 00 gauge or some very thick gauge cable for a stereo system that is only 200 or 300 watts, even 500, 600, shake your head. Absolutely not. All you need is some AWG and then whatever it's rated for. So there you have it. Another episode of this podcast in the can. I'm going to say it. Sure, that's fine. Thank you for tuning into this episode, and be sure to tune in the future in the next episode for another episode of, I'm just going to keep saying episode, aren't I? Of whatever this thing is called. This is episode 4 though. Tune into episode 5 in a couple of weeks and we'll see what topics we deal with then. Thanks for watching. Have a question you'd like answered or want to add something? Be sure to write it in the comment section down below. You can also make a suggestion for future topics of discussion. Again, comment section down below, or you can email me at soundspeeds@yahoo.com. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on future sound advice.